All right, good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from, and welcome to Crazy Talk. If this is your first time watching Crazy Talk, I am your host, Lee Thomas, and Crazy Talk is a Facebook Live podcast talk show sort of thing where I interview all sorts of people about all sorts of things related to mental health. If this is not your first time watching Crazy Talk, thank you so much for coming back. I'm really glad we haven't scared you off yet. And we really love the people who tune in every week and, leave comments and hit, the like button and the love button. We get to see the little bubbles pop up across the screen. It's all really good things. I'm also super glad to be back live. I know we've had some technical difficulties the past couple weeks. So yeah, welcome back to Crazy Talk. I'm really excited for this week. We have an amazing guest who I had the great fortune of meeting at Healthy Voices in Chicago earlier this year. Time is a weird thing. Anyway, so this week we have Jackie Zimmerman. So Jackie is a digital marketing consultant who focuses on nonprofits and healthcare related organizations. In a former life, she worked as a brand manager and communications specialist. But in 2018, she finally gave in and started working for herself at jackiezimmerman.co. And we will put a link to that in the comments below. Through her work on the site, she hopes to continue to work with great organizations and inspire patients. She began writing about living with multiple sclerosis, MS, and inflammatory bowel disease, IBD, shortly after her diagnosis as a way to connect with others. She never dreamed it would evolve into a career. Jackie has been working in advocacy for 12 years and has had the honor of representing the MS and IBD communities at various conferences, keynote speeches, and panel discussions. In her free time, what free time? She snuggles with her 2 rescue pups and her husband, Adam. She also plays roller derby. Thank you so much for joining us on the show. Welcome, Jackie.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm so excited that we got a chance to reconnect again because yeah, it's been a while since we chatted at Healthy Voices.
It was like April, which feels like an eternity ago.
Feels like forever ago. 2018 is the longest year. Yeah, so my first question, as most people who watch the show will know, it's usually kind of a why question, and it's lots of people live with chronic illnesses of all sorts that don't necessarily become advocates. So what drove you to do the work that you're doing?
So because I advocate for 2 different condition areas, the why for both of them is different, which seems like it shouldn't be, right? Seems like once you do one, you do the other. But so I was 21 when I was diagnosed with MS. And at the time, nobody in my family has it. I didn't know anybody with it. And I felt like I was the only person under 50 who had it. Because all the reading material, the literature, the blogs, the website, everything was for older people. And so what nobody was saying is that many people are diagnosed in their 20s, but everything was not directed at those people. So I actually started a newsletter. This is like a million years ago, back before blogs were a huge thing. And then that slowly evolved into a blog about living with MS as a young 20-something. And that was sort of the beginning where I was like, there are other people like me. Why are we not talking? Let's share, let's learn, because I didn't know anything about MS. So I really needed to learn from people, and was on forums a lot at that time. And so with the MS thing, it just was I did a blog so I could learn from other people. And because I was thinking maybe somebody could learn from my experience. But when I was diagnosed with IBD, it was very different because it was 3 years later. And I didn't know anybody with ulcerative colitis, same thing, no one in my family. And I was mortified. I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my family. I didn't tell my friends. I didn't tell my partner at the time. I hid it from everybody until I couldn't hide it anymore and I was hospitalized. And so at that point, I told my parents, and then I said, you have to lie to everybody too. So, my grandparents thought I took a lot of vacations that year because I was hospitalized all the time. Then that got to the point where I couldn't hide it anymore there either because I had to have surgery, numerous surgeries. So when I was facing my first surgery is when I started my blog for ulcerative colitis. And that was when kind of everything changed. That was for me as an outlet, as a catharsis, as a way to just be like, this is happening and it's terrible and I'm scared and I'm sad and I don't know anything. And then people read it, which was baffling to me. I was like, why are people reading about me talking about my butt, basically? And they did, and they liked it and they related to it. And at that time, nobody believes this, but at that time, nobody was really blogging about living with a J pouch. There were 2 different websites about J pouches, but that was it. There weren't any bloggers, or there wasn't a lot of information out there. It wasn't a term people knew. And so, and I've always been of the camp of I blog about the real stuff. So I don't, sugarcoat it, and I talk about the stuff that people didn't want to talk about. And I also say that I humiliate myself for the greater good on a regular basis, talking about like really horribly humiliating things all the time. So it was this complete turnaround from the beginning when I was diagnosed and I was like, couldn't tell anybody, to now I'm like shouting from the rooftops about like my bowel movements and what it's like, because I feel like it's helpful.
Yeah, and I think that like a lot of the times, and this is one of my pet peeves about kind of mental health advocacy, is sometimes people with mental health issues and who do mental health advocacy, we talk about like, oh, well, if someone had a physical health issue, they would never be ashamed of it. The only like health issue that anyone is ever embarrassed to have is mental health. The only health issue that is ever stigmatized is mental health. And then that was one of the things that really kind of opened my eyes at Healthy Voices, is that there are so many health issues where people have all this kind of shame and stigma around having it.
I totally agree. And so when I was really, really sick with ulcerative colitis, and when I was in the midst of my surgery, there was a lot of complications, and there was a lot of like, I might not make it through this stuff. And so I got really, really severely depressed, and started talking about that on my blog. And that was one of the times that I received an outpouring of just people who were like sending me such great vibes. It was such a wonderful, wonderful time. But that was the first time that I had this realization. I even wrote about it, that the stuff that I write here, people I know in real life read it. So when I was talking about being really depressed, or talking about like thinking about ending my life and all these really, really heavy things, I wrote them and I was like, well, cat's out of the bag, because, my mom reads this, and my friends read this, and my old coworkers might read this. And for all the stuff that I had wrote on that blog, that was probably one of the scariest things that I wrote. I could talk about literally pooping myself, and that was fine, but it was like talking about being depressed was really hard. And likewise for me, that was one of those moments that I realized, like, this is really hard to talk about. Like, this is way harder than to talk about some of the other things, so it's not even grass is greener. It's like grass is brown on both sides, basically.
Yeah, it's not great for anyone.
Right.
And did you find, like you said on your blog, you really like, you don't sugarcoat things, you tell it like it is. Do you find that knowing that people in real life are reading this blog, like, does that make you tempted sometimes to sugarcoat it?
Yeah, it does. I think I just like pretend like it doesn't happen. When my mom would say, when she finally told me she was reading it, that's when I was like, oh man, this is getting weird, because some of the stuff that I put on there. But again, I would just sort of say, like, I'm doing this because there was not this when I needed it. So other people need this or want this, or maybe they don't know, or maybe I'm literally talking to myself on my blog, and that's fine. It definitely makes me, when I'm writing, it's like I'm just writing. It's when I go back and read it like a week later that I'm like, oh man, somebody I know is probably going to see this. And that's when it gets kind of weird. But I've already put it out there at that point, so it is what it is.
Yeah, and that's something I've been thinking about a lot lately in terms of kind of advocacy in general. I work on like a lot of youth mental health projects, and there's kind of this this thing that I've noticed where they're like, oh, like youth mental health stories are important, so we're gonna have like some youth come out and tell their mental health stories, and then we're gonna trot them back off stage, and we're gonna talk about business. And I was definitely one of those youth who like was kind of trotted out to tell stories sometimes, and I really liked it because I found it very cathartic to tell my story, and I think a lot of people do. But there is this kind of the cat's out of the bag. Like once you tell that story, you can't untell it. And I think that's a responsibility that maybe we don't acknowledge enough, that, a quick Google search will tell you everything you need to know about my life, right? And I think that, that's a big sacrifice for people to make in kind of giving up a bit of privacy, I guess, or a bit of anonymity. And yeah, anyway, I'd love to hear what you think about that.
So I've had a lot of people over the years, I've been at this for like 12 years now, ask me, who are blogging under, a a fake name or not use no identifiers. They don't say where they live, how old they are, if they're what ethnicity they are, male or female, like nothing. Yeah. So, and they've said, like, I don't want this to prohibit my ability to get a job in the future or whatever, what have you. And what I always say was when I started this, I 100% was not thinking about that. I was totally not thinking about that, which had I thought about it, I might have done things differently. But at the time I was just like, the blog says, what's your name? And you're like, oh, this is my name. This is where I live. Here's everything you need to know, which again, maybe not the smartest, but what I learned in the process was, for me, I didn't have another option because I didn't think about it because I'm like kind of a dum-dum in the beginning. I was just like, here's my story, and word vomited everything. And there were definitely times looking back that I'm like, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Like, when other people started asking me if it was going to prohibit their ability to get a job, I was like, oh, I probably should have thought about that. But now, honestly, writing that blog and using my name has literally gotten me where I am now. It got me a job at one of the big three here in Michigan, a huge car company. Writing about that literally got my job there. And so, it helped me start a nonprofit. It helped me get my last job, which was working directly with patient advocates. It's helped me get some of the new clients I have now, which is, building stuff in the patient space. So it's definitely a choice, and you are giving up anonymity and you are giving up a lot of yourself, and it's totally a personal choice. Like, I never thought 12 years ago I'd be like doing this to start a career, like 100% never where I thought I would be, but it's worked out for me. I'm not going to say it's going to work out for everybody. So it's something to definitely put a lot of thought into when you're thinking about doing this.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of a no take backsies sort of situation.
Yeah, because like you said, if you Google me, you find out everything and then some. Like, stuff you don't want to know is out there about me because I put it out there. You're right. There is no taking all of that back.
Yeah. And so you've talked about like when you wrote about, depression and there was a big outpouring of support. Have you ever had like people who have kind of approached you and been like, you shouldn't be writing about this? Like whether they've sent you emails about it or tweeted at you, or like, is that a response that you've ever gotten?
I have gotten a couple, we'll call them negative comments a few times. Most of them, I still don't really understand where they come from. Some of them were personal attacks of just like, you're a dum-dum and we hate you kind of thing. And it's just, whatever. It was way easy to roll those ones off. Just, the other ones where people, maybe disagree with the way that I view things or the way that I say things. Those ones are a little bit harder because it feels more like I find that more of like a personal attack, like what I think about things or the way I experience things. But I think a lot of that comes from people who are really, really upset in their own lives, right? So if you're facing a really heavy diagnosis and you read something about how hard it can be and how, you feel really helpless as a patient, maybe you lash out because you're like, I'm not helpless, I'm fine. A lot of hurt people, I think, have written a lot of mean comments. And I always just try to think about that. But I mean, in no way am I any kind of like celebrity, but I always think about like, when you see celebrities are like, I don't Google myself, I don't read comments, I don't do any of that stuff. I do both of those things pretty regularly, but I've learned the concept of like, let it roll off.
Yeah. And just kind of like the whole, I know sometimes it can feel really like almost masochistic to be like, oh, I wrote this thing that I know people are going to have feelings about. I'm going to read the comments. No, don't do it. Oh, I'm doing it.
Yeah, I wrote a couple articles a couple months ago that are what I think are very controversial issues sort of in my communities. And I wrote them, and as I'm writing them, I'm like, this could go really bad. But like, it's where I'm at sort of in the career with this, where I write what I think and I write what I feel. And I'm really lucky that people ask me to do it, that they want to hear it. And I'm also confident enough as where I am, like as a person, as an advocate, that people can disagree with me and like, I'll still be fine with it.
Yeah. And I think that is a big, like kind of confident self-worth thing. Cause especially stuff like writing, I think is very, like vulnerable and intimate. Cause if I'm, I'm trying to think of an example. Like if I was doing something else and people were like, oh, I don't like what you're doing. It's like, well, I'm doing my job. Like, when I was scanning groceries at IGA, if people were like, I don't like the price of this apple, I'm like, nah, it's not my call. But like when I write something, when someone's like, I don't like that, it does feel like it's like, I don't like you. And you're like, no. So it takes like, I think a lot of introspection probably to get to a point where you're like, take it or leave it. Like, that's fine.
Yeah, and for me personally, so I started blogging when I was probably 21 or 22. So I wasn't old by any means, but I was a little bit into my like slightly more secure years. And the things that made me, I wasn't necessarily worried about people disagreeing with me in the beginning because I never dreamed anybody would read this stuff, right? It was like me talking to myself most of the time. And so when people started reading it, that's kind of when I started thinking about like, what do other people think about this? And then like quickly learned that you just can't do that. You know, like you have to just sort of say like, I'm going to do this and I'm going to, so I used to ride motorcycles and people would say all the time, like, oh, aren't you afraid you're going to fall? Or aren't you afraid of an accident? And what I used to tell them is kind of the same thing about blogging is like, I just don't think about it. Mm-hmm. Like if you think about it, you're pretty much like predicting what's going to happen. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I kind of just like, don't think about it. And maybe I'm just really good at compartmentalizing. Like that's, you know, learned a lot in therapy. But I just kind of brush it off, or, you know, I also don't read comments on stuff that I think might be like super, super controversial.
Yeah. And so as someone who like, you know, you've been blogging for so long and, you know, now you're running your own business and kind of doing a lot of creative things, you know what I mean? Like blogging and writing and speaking and, you know, coming up with creative solutions for people. So, you know, you've kind of made a career out of thinking creatively. Do you ever find that that's, does that feel like a lot of pressure on you sometimes where you're like, oh, like, you know, the well is dry today? Or do you have a routine to stay creative? How does that work for you?
I definitely feel like that happens specifically with blogging when I have somebody who is paying me to blog. There's only so much time in a day, right? So I've kind of not blogged a lot for myself personally because I have like if somebody's going to pay me out, we'll definitely write their blog first for sure. But a little bit of that is, you know, you have a deadline and a lot of times, you know, they give you a topic and the creative process is definitely taken out of it a little bit. And those blogs, you know, don't necessarily always feel like my voice. They feel a lot like maybe how-to guides or like, you know, here's some advice for you versus like, this is who I am, because I can't use my voice. You know, my voice is grammatically incorrect and it has swear words and it, you know, it's not a very polished article. And that's what makes it my voice. So you can't always do that. So blogging, I find that a lot when I'm writing for other sites where it's just not necessarily like my super creative bag. But a lot of the other stuff that I get to do, I work on a lot of different projects. So I find that even if it's not like the most creative project, there are so many of them that I can find other places for it. So, you know, there are definitely like, I don't want to write about this or I don't want to do this thing today moments, but some of that is like being a grown up and just being like, well, this is my job, so I have to do it. And then the other part of it is like, can I put it off? And if I can, like, is that okay? So, and then I will, if I can.
Yeah. And I think that's where a lot of people get hung up is this idea of like, I wrote this on my to-do list today and I didn't do it or I don't feel like doing it or whatever it is. And then they end up in this spiral of like, well, that means I'm a bad person because I'm not being productive and I'm not being disciplined and I'm not being, you know, this, that, and the other thing.
I definitely feel that one pretty hard. So I work from home and I work for myself. And there are days, you know, in my brain, you know, I have worked 9 to 5, 9 to 6, 8 to 5 for probably like 12 or 13 years at this point. That is kind of ingrained in like who I am. And I don't love it. It just is like repeating a routine. But there are days where I feel like I get up a little bit later, or maybe like I make a really long lunch, or I watch TV from 2 to 4, and I feel like I'm wasting time, or like I'm not being productive, and I'm not making any money. Like I feel these like negative feelings. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of have to remind myself, like, 1, this is why I do this, so I can take the liberties that I have. And 2, I do this so that way I don't stress myself out. That's the whole reason why I don't work for anybody else anymore. So I'm not stressed out. And just sort of giving yourself the permission to not be productive 24/7. Like we live in this culture where it's sort of like whoever runs themselves ragged the most wins. And I am 100% not subscribing to that anymore, where I'm just like, yeah, I'm going to just hang out today and hang out with our zoo of animals that we have at this point, and like watching a TV show. And that's enough for today. As long as I don't do that every day, I'm fine.
Yeah. And like finding that balance, I find that like you're so dead on with like the culture of, the more you work and the less you sleep and the harder you push yourself, like hustle culture is what I've been calling it. And I think you see that a lot, especially in entrepreneurship circles, or at least in the entrepreneurship circles that I've kind of found myself running in, is, people are, oh, I, get up at 4 a.m. and I've got all my emails sent off by 6 a.m. And if you haven't made like this many dollars by the end of the day, like you're not pushing yourself hard enough. And it's exhausting. It makes me like not want to be an entrepreneur.
No, I think you're right. So I took a course earlier this year, basically to like, because I said I've been freelancing, but like making it like your business.
Mm-hmm.
I took a class basically to be like, this is how you don't screw it up. And a big, huge part of that class was not being that person, was not overworking, was setting boundaries, and was like how to find ways to make sure you abide by the things that you set up. And one of that, the beginning, was writing a no more list, which is things you're never going to do anymore. Like clients you're never going to take, and people aren't going to treat you this way, and I'm never going to work past 7, and all of these things. So you start in the very beginning by saying like, I'm not doing this. But I joined other groups, and there are all these people who are running themselves into the ground. I'm like, I'm just not willing to do that. Like, that's just not who I am right now in my life. And maybe I'll be there again because I was there at one point, but like today is not that day.
Yeah. And that's so interesting to me about like the course being very much about setting boundaries and setting boundaries with yourself. Cause I think that's something a lot of people, people with and without mental health issues can really struggle with, this idea of, setting boundaries with other people. Absolutely. But a lot of it's about setting your boundaries with yourself and your own kind of emotional tolerance to all sorts of stuff, like to the way other people behave and the way other people treat you and the way you treat yourself.
I totally agree. And setting boundaries is probably the most beneficial thing I learned. I didn't really learn boundaries until I was like 30, when I started really going to therapy and being like, why are things so bad right now? And she's like, you don't set boundaries with anybody or anything. She's right. But like when I learned how to do that, and you start seeing your lack of boundaries, you immediately are like, oh my God, I need so many more of these. And it feels good to set them, and it feels good to abide by them. And, whether you're setting boundaries, like, I think boundaries are directly correlated to mental health for everybody, everyone in the whole world. Because, if you're working, you're overworking, you're stressed out. If you're then you're worried about this and you're worried about that. And like everything affects mental health like that. And I think setting healthy boundaries with people and places and all of these things just makes us all like happier, calmer, healthier people.
Yeah. And I think it again comes back to that idea of like what we already talked about with self-worth, where people, sometimes don't feel like they are worth setting boundaries for, right? And I'm just airing all my pet peeves with like mental health advocacy in this conversation, I guess. But I think sometimes we see even mental health advocates doing like sharing memes and stuff that really, I think, almost glorify not setting boundaries. Like this whole idea of like, everyone takes from me, and like I'm only giving, and no one realizes that your strong friend needs help and all that sort of stuff, which is like, it's important to talk about, taking care of your strong friend, but I think it's also important that we like maybe stop glamorizing being the strong friend or the one that everyone comes to for help all the time or whatever it is. But sometimes people kind of take that lack of boundaries and make it their identity.
I agree. And the thing about boundaries too is like, people aren't happy when you put them up, right? When you're like, hey, this is my boundary with you, friend or coworker or whatever. People who can feel it, they don't like them. So it makes it really hard to like keep wanting to do it. So I think, people who are uncomfortable with it or like kind of wavering on it, the second you get pushback, a lot of people are like, nope, just kidding. I don't have that anymore. But I think it's so important, and it goes back to self-worth, right? Like I'm willing to upset some other people to make sure that like I stay happy and that I stay sane, basically, even if it like, and I have definitely made some people angry with my boundaries, but like, it's what I need. And I'm willing to say like, I need this. I'm sorry if that made you upset, Yeah.
And that was like one of like the best things I ever read on the internet. And I honestly couldn't tell you where I read it. It was basically the phrase like, if you say no and someone gets mad, that does not mean you should have said yes. And that was like a real light bulb moment for me.
Yeah. And I think that goes back to like we're talking about society as a whole now, right? Same idea of like overworking, but like, say yes to everything and make other people happy and, like put yourself second. So that way nope, I don't do any of that anymore. Like I think wholly subscribe to put your mask on first kind of thing, your boundaries come first and other people come second. And I tell parents this all the time, like, you should come before your kids. I know that feels wrong. And I know that you don't want to do that, but like, you should always be number one in your life, no matter who you are and what you're doing. You are always number one. And a lot of people do not agree with that. But I think that that's like the only way you can live a life where you have self-worth, a life where you're happy, a life where you have the capacity to give to other people. I don't know. This is like very long. I've got a lot of opinions on that one.
No, and I think that's huge. And that's like, I don't think I've ever heard anyone phrase it that bluntly before, but like, I love that. And especially, I think people forget that we're role modeling for people a lot of the time. And so, if I set a healthy boundary with a coworker and that coworker doesn't like it, and I go like, well, sorry, that's my boundary. Like that's, who knows who I'm role modeling for, right? Like I'm partly, building trust in myself, but I could be role modeling for youth in my life or even other coworkers to be like, hey, like I didn't realize that was a thing that we could do. Cause in a lot of places there is kind of this culture of like, you say yes to everything. Otherwise you have a bad attitude and you're not a team player.
Well, and sometimes it's literally saying, this is my boundary, which I think some people are worried that it sounds like too like therapy talk to be like, this is my boundary. But to me, that's the final. Like when I tell somebody like, this is my boundary or I'm sorry you feel that way, to me, it's done. It's over. Like I've told you, like I can tell you what the boundary is, but some people I think still feel like they can push on that or they can negotiate around it. And for me, like once I say this is it, I don't think people realize like you can say that. Like, you can say my boundary is XYZ thing. To me, that's the end all be all. And like then if you don't respect that, then like you're further proving why I need the boundary there.
Yeah, you're like, if you're going to disrespect this boundary, then there's probably no boundaries in my life that you're going to respect, right? I love the idea of like overtly saying just like, this is my boundary. That's where it is. Now you know.
Yeah, it takes out the guesswork. And to me, like it helps me understand who is going to validate me and respect my boundaries, right? If I can tell you this is my boundary explicitly and you're like, yeah, I don't really care, then like I am able to evaluate your spot in my life without regret,
I love that. And I can't believe like this has gone by so quick, but we are actually running out of time, which is wild to me. This has been such an amazing conversation. So thank you so much, Jackie, for being on the show. For the folks who are watching or watching the replay and going like, wow, Jackie is absolutely amazing. I want to find out more. How can I get in touch? What would you like people to do after the show?
So you can check out, the easiest thing is my website, which is just jackiezimmerman.co. There are links to all my social channels on there. You can find me on Twitter at JackieZim. There's a lot of people squatting on my name in various social channels, so I had to get creative. But I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter, I'm on all the things. But the best place is probably just my website.
Okay, awesome. And again, we're gonna put a link to that website in the comments below. A couple minutes after the end of the show, we'll give ourselves some time. So Jackie, thank you again so much for being on the show. This was so much fun and such a great conversation.
Thank you for having me. I hope that we get to like hang out at Healthy Voices again next year.
Oh, I hope so. I'm just waiting to hear back about so many things. But yes, I definitely hope I get to see you in Dallas. And for those of you who are watching the show and going, wow, Crazy Talk is so much fun. I want to get episodes of Crazy Talk directly to my inbox. You can do that by signing up for my mailing list at leethomas.ca. And I will also put a link to it in the comments below a couple of minutes after the end of the show as well. So thank you everyone for tuning in. Thanks again, Jackie. And be sure to tune in next week on Wednesday at 6 p.m. Mountain Time for another episode of Crazy Talk. Thanks so much and have a great evening, everyone.
Bye.